Hi there, welcome to the Bowery Boys. This is Greg Young with a good old-fashioned tale of New York political corruption. Or is it? This is the thing about Chester A. Arthur, perhaps one of the most mediocre presidents who has ever lived. And that's not according to me, I swear. In fact, in researching his life for the following show, I've actually found much to like, if not necessarily admire, about old Chester. But according to multiple polls of historians over the decades, Arthur ranks around the bottom third. In fact, according to the 2014 Rodinger and DeSoto survey, he actually ranked at the bottom of the most memorable presidents. Or shall I say, he was the most forgettable. Now, if you know anything about Arthur at all, it's that he was vice president under James Garfield and became the president when Garfield was assassinated by Charles Guiteau. You may have heard that he lived in New York. He holds the unique distinction of being one of two men to be inaugurated for the job in the city. The first, of course, being George Washington. Arthur is no Washington, of course, but his story takes some incredible twists, partially because Arthur's motivations sharply change over his lifetime. A principled young man who becomes entranced and even corrupted by New York's Gilded Age opportunities, drunk with power, and of course actual liquor, who seems then to turn against some of those unethical indulgences once he's given real power. But I like to frame aspects of his life as they played out in New York City itself, the city which built, then corrupted, and perhaps reinvigorated America's accidental president. In 1854, Elizabeth Jennings Graham was a black school teacher who taught at New York's African Free School and was a member of the city's prosperous African-American community. Her father, Thomas, was born a freeman, but her mother had been enslaved. Now, slavery had been abolished in New York since 1827, and by the 1850s, several places within New York City were stops on the Underground Railroad, which transported enslaved people into the North and into Canada. But many in the city were actually quite sympathetic to the Southern cause of slavery. While there was no enshrined legal justification for segregation in public spaces, many stores, restaurants, and private operators openly banned blacks from their establishments, or in the case of public transportation, from their streetcars. On July 16, 1854, Jennings attempted to board a streetcar at Pearl Street and Chatham Street on her way to church, where she was an organist. I quote now from Horace Greeley's depiction of events, which was published just a few months later, quote, "She got upon one of the company's cars last summer on the Sabbath to ride to church. The conductor undertook to get her off, first alleging the car was full. When that was shown to be false, he pretended the other passengers were displeased at her presence. But when she insisted on her rights, he took hold of her by force to expel her. She resisted. The conductor got her down on the platform, jammed her bonnet, soiled her dress, and injured her person. Quite a crowd gathered, but she effectively resisted. Finally, after the car had gone on further, with the aid of a policeman, they succeeded in removing her." Over 100 years later, we would see a similar incident with another black woman named Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. Here in New York in the mid-19th century, the members of New York's black population were used to racist behaviors against them, but never something so violent and humiliating. Thanks to her father's connections, word of this incident circulated and galvanized the entire community. Thomas then sued the Third Avenue Railway Company and sought out a law firm with success in litigating cases involving black defendants. They chose the law firm of Erastus Culver, due in part to a case that he had argued with John Jay, the grandson of the former Chief Justice and Founding Father John Jay, involving the freedom of enslaved people who passed through New York, which was, after all, a free state and city. In 1852, they argued for the freedom of several people who had passed through, enslaved by a Virginian. But thanks to Culver and Jay, they were freed. And so, by the time Thomas Jennings employed the firm, it had changed its name to Culver, Parker, and Arthur, for its newest, youngest member, Chester A. Arthur. Now, this might seem to be a strange place for a man later nicknamed the Dude, but given his early origins, it seemed like a natural fit. Charles Allen Arthur was born on October 5th, 1829, named Chester after his doctor, in the town of Fairfield, Vermont, to William and Melvina Arthur, who were forces in the early 19th century abolition movement. The Irish-born William Arthur was a fiery Free Will Baptist minister who, according to biographer Scott S. Greenberger, quote, would not smooth the rough edges of his beliefs or soften his pronouncements in deference to prevailing opinion, unquote. The Arthurs continued to move to various towns in New York, right around the time that the prosperities brought on by the opening of the Erie Canal were beginning to enrich the region. They eventually moved to Schenectady, a vital stop on the Erie Canal. Today's Erie Boulevard in town actually lives on to mark the path, and it was here that young Chester went to college. At this time, he was, according to Greenberger, quote, slender and sociable, with fashionably long hair and a cheerful disposition, unquote. He would remain sociable, if not slender. His gregarious nature and team-building charms would become defining and useful traits as he got older, even if the results of his strict Christian upbringing would eventually drift away. Right after college, he taught and eventually studied law, which invariably led him to the doorstep of one of his father's friends, the Brooklyn lawyer and abolitionist, Erastus Culver. In 1853, Arthur wrote of New York, quote, if one is ambitious and makes it a great object of life to succeed, there is no doubt, but this is the place, unquote. The following year, Arthur would argue his first case, representing Elizabeth Jennings Graham in her case against the Third Avenue Railroad Company. In retrospect, this case looms far greater than it did in 1854, which is why it was given to such a green and inexperienced lawyer. While the case was eventually tried the following year in Brooklyn, as the company was actually headquartered there, it still caused quite a scene. According to the New York Times, quote, the courtroom was crowded almost to suffocation, and at one time serious trouble was threatened by those who believed that to seek justice for a black man was to do injustice to humanity, unquote. Against the odds, however, Elizabeth Jennings won her case. According to author Jerry McArenda, quote, segregation no longer made business sense, and the railroad ordered its workers to allow any paying customer to ride, unquote. This, however, did not catapult Arthur into New York's storied legal stratosphere. Instead, another event would play a much greater role, and he wasn't even directly involved with it. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was signed into federal law, threatening the balance between the slave states in the South and the free states of the North, a situation which suddenly turned Kansas into a literal battleground between those who were for and against the institution of slavery. In its wake, the weak and fragile Whig Party split asunder into pro- and anti-slavery factions, and those against the expansion of slavery formed an entirely new political party called the Republican Party. And given Arthur's abolitionist upbringing, it's not surprising that he would become one of the first Republicans and one of its most passionate members. In 1857, in fact, he even headed out west to Kansas in order to set up a law practice. But at the end of the day, Chester A. Arthur was not a cowboy, he was a New Yorker. On October 25th, 1859, Chester married Ellen Lewis Herndon at Calvary Church on East 22nd Street and today's Park Avenue South. Now, that church is still there today, just outside the upscale neighborhood of Gramercy Park to its east. Ellen, or Nell, was the daughter of famed Captain William Herndon, who went down with the ship the SS Central America 2 years earlier, and so she was quite famous, and the couple was sympathetically received by New York high society. When the American Civil War broke out less than 2 years later, Arthur rose to the occasion when he was appointed New York's Quartermaster General, responsible for organizing and supplying the many Union Army soldiers who began flooding the city. But New York was a very divided state, and the city of New York was even more so. To the victor go the spoils, and with new Democratic leadership, he and many other Republicans were out of a job in 1863. And even though the actual Civil War was over by 1865, for Chester A. Arthur, a loyal Republican foot soldier, his battles were just beginning. And right during one of the most storied, corrupt periods in American history. More on Chester A. Arthur, New York's gentleman boss, right after this. What were some of the most powerful places in America right after the Civil War? You might say the White House or the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., possibly a bank or the offices of Cornelius Vanderbilt. But I would recommend 55 Wall Street, the grandiose merchant exchange building in all its Greek revival glory, built immediately in the aftermath of the Great Fire of 1835. Now, believe it or not, the building is still there. In the early 20th century, they actually lobbed off the domed ceiling on top and then added several new floors. You probably know the building today as the site of Cipriani Wall Street. But in Chester A. Arthur's time, this was the U.S. Custom House. With New York a thriving port city, all international goods entering here were required to pay import duties. 75% of all import duties at this time came through the U.S. Custom House here at 55 Wall Street. Whichever political party controlled the Custom House, with a slight or then later shameless extreme bending of ethics, whoever controlled it could amass a financial war chest and wield great influence. It was one of the most coveted jobs within the political spoils system of the late 19th century, a place where you could reward loyalists with a cushy and lucrative job. And it was a federally appointed system. In fact, it was the largest federal employer in the country. And so the man that held the keys to the Custom House became a major power broker. And on November 21st, 1871, President Ulysses S. Grant handed those keys to Chester A. Arthur. In New York after the Civil War, at the birth of what will be called the Gilded Age, there were very few examples of clean politics. There was only dirty and dirtier. This, after all, was the era of William Boss Tweed, who maneuvered victories for the Democratic political machine, Tammany Hall, and used those political connections to enrich himself and his cronies. By 1869, he was essentially in charge of the city of New York, with Tammany men stationed everywhere, from the city council to the governor's chair in Albany. The cost of great construction projects, from the Brooklyn Bridge to the gas company, ballooned in direct proportion to the size of his cronies' wallets. In 1871, Tweed's great downfall began thanks to investigative reporting by the New York Times and the cartoons of Thomas Nast in Harper's Weekly. But Tweed's rivals in the Republican Party, well, they were no angels either. On the federal level, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, became the first president to be impeached, although he did remain in power, and the administration of his successor, President Ulysses S. Grant, was riddled with corruption scandals. In fact, Chester A. Arthur would very much benefit from one of these scandals, thanks to a brand new friend, Roscoe Conkling. Quote, "He does not dress or talk or walk or play as others did or do. There was something in his manner, there was something in his style, different from that of other men. He knew it and glorified in that fact, unquote. That's one journalist describing Roscoe Conkling, a conniving and dashing man who quickly identified Chester Arthur as a reliable and effective political lieutenant for the Republicans. Now, Conkling worked the official corridors of national politics. He had served both in the House, and by 1871, he was a New York senator. While Arthur, who had never been elected to anything, used his persuasive frat boy aura to excite and recruit men and corral local support for Republican causes. According to The Nation, quote, Mr. Arthur conceived and put in operation the idea of taking from the ranks of the Democratic Party men who had learned the business of practical politics and making them pioneers in the same business in the Republican Party. He succeeded so well with it that within a few years, he had a Republican organization that was capable of fighting Tammany with its own weapons, and with such efficiency that Tammany was frequently compelled to, quote, deal with it in order to save itself from harm, unquote. This sort of political wheeling and dealing grew increasingly messy. Negotiations were often done under the influence of liquor, and according to one of Chester's friends, quote, he could drink a great deal without any visible symptoms of intoxication, unquote. Within some of the seediest dance halls and saloons in Greenwich Village, Arthur played poker and smoked cigars, drained wine bottles, and liquored up his companions until they collapsed from their seats. One of the, quote, Arthur's boys said he was always the last man to go to bed in any company and was fond of sitting down on his front steps at 3 a.m. and talking until anyone dared to stay. By the 1860s, the Arthurs lived at 123 Lexington Avenue, and where Nell, according to the First Lady's fact book, quote, embellished it with the finest furniture and accessories that money could buy, and she hired a staff of Irish immigrant servants to help her step up her lavish entertaining, unquote. She also grew weary of her husband's nightly carousing, instead desiring to be part of the city's growing high society. Through her family connections, she most certainly would have been welcomed into the most elite parlors, and her address book included the names Astor, Roosevelt, and Vanderbilt. But she did come to embrace her husband's political ambitions, even when they physically changed him. The evenings of steaks, cigars, and whiskey taking their tolls on his once slender frame. Yet this only seemed to add to his allure. According to author George Frederick Howe, quote, he was a domineering figure in any group, tall, portly, carefully dressed, his Burnsides well-groomed, his frank, ruddy face noteworthy for the commanding dark eyes, his manner dignified and courteous, unquote. Now, at the word of Roscoe Conkling, in 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant appointed Thomas Murphy as the collector of the port of New York, overseeing the U.S. Custom House. Murphy, Conkling, and his cronies soon enriched themselves as imported items under the supervision of the Custom House started springing leaks, mysteriously breaking open, or simply falling off the back of a truck, as they might say today, and then were promptly resold. The scheme was so relatively open that reporters from the New York Tribune got wind of this, and by 1871, Thomas Murphy was forced to resign, and then he was replaced by Chester A. Arthur. It would be in this capacity that Arthur became the gentleman boss of the New York Republicans, or as his lieutenants sometimes called him, General Arthur, for he commanded an army of loyal employees, many of whom were appointed because they donated a, quote, voluntary contribution to Republican campaigns. Institutions overseen by Democrats, such as City Hall, were operated in a similar fashion. You promoted your kind of people with no consideration of their abilities or experience. This was called the spoils system. Most historians actually consider Arthur to be slightly more honest than his predecessors, but he was rewarded handsomely with a salary of $50,000, or in today's currency, $1 million, which meant he made more money than President Grant. He remained the collector through the entire presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. But when Rutherford B. Hayes became president, Arthur was finally fired in 1878. Hayes was also a Republican, but this whole messy political patronage system, this whole corrupt spoils system, had by the time of Hayes, split the Republican Party into two factions. Hayes was a part of what they called the half-breeds, which were Republicans against patronage, while Arthur and Conkling were the leaders of the stalwarts. They were like, why fix a good thing? Tragedy actually pushed Arthur more into politics, into an almost consuming life of politics, when on January 12th, 1880, his wife Nell died of pneumonia. Now, despite their differing lives, Chester had deeply loved Nell, and in fact, he never remarried. And that was not the only tumultuous life change awaiting Chester A. Arthur. For later that year, 1880, at the Republican National Convention, to replace Rutherford B. Hayes, who had chosen not to run, the half-breeds and the stalwarts found themselves at loggerheads with one another. Arthur and Conkling's gang were hoping for another term actually for Ulysses S. Grant, while their rivals backed candidate James Blaine and John Sherman. But in a dramatic swell of sudden support, Ohio Congressman James A. Garfield then took the lead. He was a man of the half-breeds, and thus he won the nomination. Conkling, of course, was not pleased and then made it known that the stalwart faction would not support the Republican candidate Garfield unless there was somebody from their faction next to his side, and in particular, somebody from New York. And it's through these bizarre circumstances that Conkling's friend Chester A. Arthur became the Republicans' vice presidential candidate, a compromise that honestly did not really make anyone very happy. And believe it or not, Conkling had told Arthur to turn the offer down. Chester actually replied, quote, "The office of the vice president is a greater honor than I ever dreamed of attaining," unquote. It's certainly true. He had never been elected for any actual public office. And so on November 2nd, 1880, the United States went to the polls, and eventually James Garfield was elected president and Chester A. Arthur his vice president. The man who was basically the role model for a patronage system which many in Washington were actually trying to break free from. Well, we get to the final and most surprising twist in the life of Chester A. Arthur right after this. Today in New York, foodies flock to the address 123 Lexington Avenue to visit a food landmark, the fantastic spice store Callustian's, which was founded in 1944, featuring food items from all over the world, and perhaps the most famous spot in this area that's just south of Murray Hill, lovingly called Curry Hill, for its popular Indian restaurants. This building, it's actually a brownstone, has been rather transformed since it was first constructed. Tom Miller at the website Daytonian in Manhattan writes, quote, 4 stories tall over the high English basement, it stretched 3 bays wide. The cast iron railings that rose along the side brownstone stoop turned to form balconies at the parlor windows, unquote. The only evidence of its most famous former resident is a small, obscured plaque near the vestibule today. The second floor features the shop's legendary selection of spices, as well as exotic teas, bitters, syrups, and alcoholic mixers. But this second floor was also the former parlor of the Vice President of the United States. And it was late in the evening on September 19th, 1881, that you would have found Chester A. Arthur here, dressed in black, in terrible grief, lit only by the dimmest gaslight. He was not alone that night. His company included the lawyer Elihu Root, once known for his associations with Boss Tweed, and the men all waited the grim news, which would soon change their lives. The house was filled with sadness and terror. At 11:30, Chester heard a rapping at the door. It was a reporter from the New York Sun. "Have you heard the news? The president is dead." "Oh, it cannot be true," said Chester. "It cannot be. I have heard nothing." "A dispatch has just been sent to the Sun office," said the reporter. Chester began weeping and ran back to his friends in the back room. "They say he is dead." They were in their very final moments of avoiding the inevitable, which dissipated at the mournful midnight chime of the hallway clock. Then there was a second knock, a telegram for Chester. He slowly read it, then dropped it, covering his face with his hands. It read, "It becomes our painful duty to inform you of the death of President Garfield and to advise you to take the oath of office as President of the United States without delay." Another reporter arrived. There would be many, many others, and this one was greeted by Arthur's valet. "Would the president like to make a statement?" the reporter asked. The valet returned, "I dare not ask him. He's sitting alone in his room, sobbing like a child, with his head on his desk. I dare not disturb him," unquote. What a terrible way to become the 21st president of the United States. Over 8 months earlier, Arthur had been in a much jollier mood, celebrating his new job at Delmonico's at its Fifth Avenue location, where, in fact, Lobster Newburgh had just been invented a few years before. In front of a guest list that included Jay Gould, J. Pierpont Morgan, Henry Ward Beecher, and the former president, Ulysses S. Grant, a drunken Chester Arthur began spewing invectives at absent foes and spilling campaign secrets in front of reporters who were frantically scribbling everything down. He came off looking like a dance hall lush. Very few people outside of perhaps his bestie, Roscoe Conkling, were very excited about the notion of Chester A. Arthur in higher office. In fact, he spent much of his vice presidency pretty much doing nothing of true value for the American people, propping up stalwart voices and sowing discord aimed at President Garfield. Arthur simply could not shake his New York connections, would not shake them, in fact, despite the demands of greater office. When President Garfield appointed William H. Robertson, a non-Conkling man, to the collector of the Port of New York, Arthur's old job, the absolutely outraged Conkling resigned his Senate seat in a dramatic protest. Yet, when he actually later tried running for that seat again, he lost. And through all of this drama, the vice president actually stood by Conkling, so subservient, in fact, that Harper's Weekly ran a cartoon of Arthur shining Conkling's shoes. On July 2nd, 1881, just a few months after he was inaugurated, President James Garfield was shot at a train station in Washington, D.C. by Charles Guiteau, a disturbed and disgruntled individual frustrated in his many attempts to seek government employment. He was a stalwart, and if there were any questions as to his motives, he shouted after he shot Garfield, quote, "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts. I did it, and I want to be arrested. Arthur is president now." Garfield suffered in pain for many months, exacerbated by unsanitary medical practices, as the bullet remained lodged in his body. He died on September 19th, 79 days after he was first shot. And then the country freaked out. According to Candace Miller in the book Destiny of the Republic, quote, "Enraged by the very idea of Arthur taking over the presidency, Americans across the country readied themselves as if for battle. Some took a tactical approach, frantically trying to revive a rumor, a conspiracy theory, you might say, started during the campaign that the vice president had been born in Canada and so was constitutionally prohibited from becoming president. Others were ready to take more drastic measures. Police departments prepared their men for riots as agitated crowds gathered in the city streets. In Ohio, men proclaimed that they would not hesitate to shoulder their muskets and go to Washington to prevent the inauguration of Arthur. All this weighed upon Chester A. Arthur in his Lexington Avenue brownstone that early morning of September 20th. With the chandelier now lit in the parlor, New York Supreme Court Judge John R. Brady came in to administer the oath of office at 2:15 in the morning. It would be a very surreal and dizzying day. Even as Arthur finally went to sleep at 5 in the morning, after a lot of smoking, actually, crowds began gathering in the street. The new president would not be staying here for very long because by 11 a.m., he was on his way to Long Branch to see the body of President Garfield, and then he was headed to Washington and his destiny. But he did have a guardian angel of sorts, or an admirer. On the Upper East Side at 54 East 74th Street lived a reclusive, bedridden woman named Julia Sand, who began to write Arthur a series of, well, I guess you could call them pep talks. The first was received at the Lexington Avenue brownstone just a few weeks before President Garfield's death. Quote, "The hours of Garfield's life are numbered. Before this meets your eye, you may be president. The people are bowed in grief, not so much because he is dying as because you are his successor. Force the nation to have faith in you. Show from the first that you have none but the purest of aims. 100 years hence, schoolboys will recite your name in the list of presidents and tell of your administration. And what shall posterity say? It is for you to choose." Unquote. Over the many months, with Arthur now the president, she began to dispense some fairly good political advice for a woman essentially cloistered from both politics and society in her home at 46 East 74th Street, a house which, like Arthur's, is still standing today. Chester had perhaps never heard such sage and purely offered advice from a person who may have had some sympathetic political leanings, but seemed just mostly concerned with his well-being. She didn't ask anything of him. This correspondence meant so much to him that he kept 23 of her letters. She wrote, quote, "Once in a while, there comes a crisis which renders miracles feasible. The great tidal wave of sorrow, which has rolled over the country, has swept you loose from your old moorings and set you up on a mountaintop, alone. If there is a spark of true nobility in you, now is the occasion to let it shine. Reform." Perhaps we can attribute what happened next to Julia Sand, for Chester A. Arthur became a changed man. Well, as much as we can expect of a man like Arthur in the 1880s. He couldn't fully pull away from his deep partisan background, but he soon began to exhibit some independent thought. And in one very surprising action, which tore out the roots of his New York political upbringing. In his first speech as president, he advocated for civil service reform, an end to the patronage system, to the spoils system, which had, in effect, made his career. The Pendleton Civil Service Act, which arose from his activism, required government office appointments be given to people of merit, people with experience and who were good at their jobs. You could no longer just give a bunch of money to those within the president's circle, i.e. his political party, to win a cushy position. It actually became illegal to fire people for political reasons, and in a rather double-edged legacy, it made those small voluntary contributions, remember those, which were used as party fundraising? Well, it made those illegal. So political parties thus eventually turned to wealthier donors since they could no longer get those smaller ones from the aspiring middle class. Now, you know who didn't like all this? Chester A. Arthur's old friend Roscoe Conkling, thinking that, he had a friend in high places, he demanded the firing of Robertson over at the Custom House. Remember that drama? So he thought that he would get rid of him. And so, of course, Conkling prepared to kind of move in and start advising the president. Instead, Arthur discarded Roscoe Conkling in a rather dramatic fashion. Conkling, in fact, stormed out of their meeting, and the two never reconciled. For such an ominous start, the Arthur presidency was actually pretty calm. The country's prosperity in the mid-1880s in the hands of unregulated industrialists and the expansion of the railroad. Arthur also remodeled the White House at this time, spending $110,000 to replace the carpets and rugs and to install the very first elevator. He also hired Louis Comfort Tiffany to restyle several rooms in a modern, showy splendor, pomegranate drapes, bejeweled glass screens, and a main corridor ceiling in gold and silver with colorful tracings that spelled out USA. Well, even with the Tiffany touch, nobody mistook this for a Vanderbilt mansion. But Arthur does play a part in actually one big, ugly chapter of this period. In 1882, Congress passed a law banning Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States for 20 years. Now, due to the racism of the day, many in Congress saw the Chinese as heathens and inferior, and also taking jobs away from Americans. Remember the Chester Arthur that defended Elizabeth Jennings Graham in that streetcar case? Well, that old Arthur resurfaced for a little bit. The president actually vetoed the bill after it had passed Congress, claiming that it violated treaties. However, Congress soon tried again by lowering the exclusion to 10 years. And at this point, Arthur acquiesced. And on May 6, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed into law. Oh, you know that Julia Sand had something to say to the president about this. Quote, "What is there to admire about half measures? What you do now, if you do right, will wash out all the harm you ever did in your life. But nothing that you can do after will obliterate your presidential record. That will stand for or against you, for or against the good of the country. Are you going to let your administration be a failure?" Unquote. On March 4th, 1885, Grover Cleveland was sworn in as the 22nd president of the United States. That unexpected presidency of Chester A. Arthur was over. He returned to New York City and actually was surprisingly unhated. In fact, there was a serious campaign to recruit him to run for the Senate, but he declined because by this time he was already gravely unhealthy. He returned to his New York townhouse on Lexington Avenue and attempted to return to law, but he was often too ill to even enter the office. Interestingly, he became the president of a company called the New York Arcade Railway, which was an early idea for a proposed underground transit system. But in the end, this never went anywhere. Arthur spent his last days in his home on Lexington Avenue in a very weakened state, but still received a few admiring visitors. He also burned, interestingly enough, all of his letters and diaries, except for the letters from Julia Sand, which stand today as the most curious artifacts associated with Chester A. Arthur, who died of a cerebral hemorrhage on November 18th, 1886, here at his home at 123 Lexington Avenue. From the New York Times obituary, quote, "In the closing hour of his life, he opened his eyes several times and in the end turned his head on the pillow. Then all was over." On March 12th, 1888, Arthur's friend turned foe, Roscoe Conkling, collapsed in Union Square during the monstrous snowstorm known as the Great Blizzard of 1888. He died over a month later at the Hoffman House of meningitis. His statue was installed in Madison Square Park just a few years later in 1893, so 6 years before his frenemy Chester A. Arthur, which may have provided him with some satisfaction beyond the grave. But Julia Sand survived them all. She passed away in 1933 during the administration of a far, far different president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, surviving the man that she encouraged and mentored for almost 5 decades. By the way, Sand and Arthur did actually meet in 1882 at her Upper East Side home, and later on she did ask to see him again. In the final letter that we have from Miss Sand, she wrote, quote, "If you can remember a time when you were very unhappy, and I tried to say things to comfort you, and you did care for my sympathy, then do come. It is very hard for me to take hold of life again, and I am very grateful to those who help me at all to be cheerful." Check out BoweryBoysHistory.com, where I'll conjure up some old photos of Mr. Arthur and the gang and show you some of those statues that I spoke about. I want to give a shout out to Brad Vogel, landmark activist and friend, who has been trying for years to get the Chester A. Arthur House landmarked. If nothing else, please pay Callustians a visit sometime. It is a surprisingly cavernous place with the best spice collection in New York City. I think that Chester A. Arthur would have loved a good spicy meal. I kind of think he'd be happy with what's going on in this space right now. By the way, we are doing some fun revamps over at patreon.com/BoweryBoys. And for those who contribute and help support the show, one of those revamps, I'm going to start a regular column on Patreon about the upcoming book that I'm working on. I'm about halfway through. So please send me your thoughts and good wishes. But I'll elaborate further over on Patreon. But we also have Side Streets, our regular behind-the-scenes podcast, exclusive on Patreon. We have early episodes, exclusive merchandise, and so much more. So please join us over at patreon.com/BoweryBoys. This episode was produced and edited by Kieran Gannon. So thank you very much for listening. Have a great New York week, whether you live here or not.